Labas vakaras visiems. Oi, koks garsas. Man labai džiugu, gal prisistatysiu pati, Liana Rokytė Jonson, Lietuvos kultūros atašė Švedijoje, Suomijoje ir Danijoje. Su Larsu Movinu susipažinom visai dar neseniai. Tiesiog labai įdomus toks mano pirmas turbūt Danijoje vaikščiojantis susitikimas vyko palei, reiškia, kanalus, ten einant link undinėlės, aišku, iki jos nepriėjom, nes užsiplėskė daug diskusijų ir, pradėjom diskutuoti apie jo visą kūrybinį palikimą. Tai yra rašytojas, kinematografas, kuratorius, rašytojas, kuris parašęs yra daugiau kaip 30 knygų, tai yra ekspertas Amerikos avangardo meno. Ir aišku, jo, kaip mes vadinam, avangardo Bibliją, visai neseniai išėjusios, jisai pats turbūt pristatys tą knygą, rasite daniškai Nacionalinėje dailės galerijoje, kaip tik direktoriai įteikta ši knyga, iš tikrųjų įspūdinga. Žmogus, kuris iš tikrųjų visą savo gyvenimą pašventęs, stebėdamas, analizuodamas, aprašydamas avangardo meną, ypač Amerikos. Ir aišku, pagrindiniai jo du herojai, tai yra Jonas Mekas ir Jurgis Mačiūnas, kaip nekeista. Ir aišku, šitas pokalbis tiesiog išsivystė į tai, kad būtų jam kaip ir gerai atvažiuoti į Lietuvą, o kadangi Larsas Movinas yra taip pat ir Danijos nacionalinio kino instituto filmotekos programų sudarytojas, jau daugelį metų. Ir žinoma, mes planuojame kitais metais Danijoje pristatyti net 6 programas po 90 minučių ir keletą filmų, kurie pristato patį Joną Meką kaip kūrėją. Ir žinoma, čia mūsų tokie keliai susiėjo ir kilo mintis, kad šį žmogų iš tikrųjų reikia atvežti į Vilnių. Ir kaip tik nesenai vyko kitų metų Jono Meko projektų partnerių sąskrydis, jeigu taip galim pavadinti, 24-25, ir tame tarpe, reiškia, Lars Movinas, jis atstovauja Nacionalinį kino institutą Danijoje, filmoteką. Tai mes, aišku, negalėjom nepasinaudoti tą progą ir dėka Lolitos, labai ačiū Nacionaliniai dailės galerijai, sutiko surengti filmo peržiūrą. Filmas, kuris sukurtas 90 metais, aišku, dedikuotas Fluxus judėjimo 30-mečiui. Gal jis autorius pats daugiau pristatys šį filmą. Tačiau jis kaip ekspertas Fluxus, tai, žinoma, jisai daug kur pasaulyje važinėja ir skaito paskaitas, tai manau, filmas bus papildytas trumpa paskaita. Ir žinoma, laukiam klausimų, kad diskusija vis dėlto išsilepsnotų, nes tai yra ta gyvybė, kuri reikalinga santykėje su auditorija. Ir labai džiaugiamės, kad penktadienį tokį vakarą susirinkote, iš tikrųjų pašventėt savo vakarą šiam kūrėjui ir, žinoma, menui. Fluxus. Tai aš dar kartą labai dėkoju visiems ir perdodu tada žodį Larsui Movinui. Lars Movin, please, if you would like to say some words before the screening, so you're welcome to do that.
Thank you for... Hello? Hello, yeah, there you go. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm sure it was all true. I hope so. Thank you, Liana, for bringing me here, and thank you to the Lithuanian Cultural Institute for some wonderful days here in Lithuania. And thank you for the National Gallery for hosting this event, and most of all, thank you for all of you to be here on a Friday night, spending your Friday late afternoon on this event here and Fluxus. I will actually say more than a few words. I prepared a little lecture, which I hope was the idea.
I just said that lecture after, so then I made a mistake.
Oh, okay. So I will actually talk first for about half an hour, actually, and then the film will be a little less than 80 minutes, so you are in for a full program. And I think we have to leave about 7, so if anybody wants to comment or ask anything after the film, I will be around, but let's see what is possible in terms of the closing time. Anyway, thank you. Some time ago, I read a collection of essays by the avant-garde composer Morton Feldman. And in one of the essays, which was entitled "Give My Regards to 8th Street," it's from 71, and it's sort of about how everything was up in the air, you could say, on the art scene of New York in the 1950s. He said, "What was great about the 50s was that for one brief moment, maybe say 6 weeks, nobody understood art. That's why it all happened. Because for a short while, these people were left alone, and 6 weeks is all it takes to get started." Today, when we think of American art in the 50s, we usually think of maybe like abstract expressionism and Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, or we think of bebop jazz and improvisation. We think of a new kind of avant-garde filmmaking, personal and poetic, and far away from the surrealism and the symbolism of the 1930s. That could be, for instance, Jonas Mekas. We think of the beat poets and their spontaneous Bob prosody, a new approach to literature which was kind of abstract expressionism and a bebop poetics rolled into one and then blown out of the mouths of street poets as spontaneous spoken word statements. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, etc., etc. Allen Ginsberg, Howard. It was art that was wild, powerful, somewhat macho, expressionistic, some pain-ridden reactions to the atomic nightmare of the Second World War, but also ecstatic, almost joyful outpourings of the soul of the artist. All new, in a sense, yes, but still individualistic, romantic. And that was not what Morton Feldman was talking about in the quote. No, what he was talking about was another trend that was going on at the same time, a trend that not so much had to do with the bearing of the soul of the artist or with expressing oneself on canvas or in other media, but was more about concepts, ideas, observations, about letting materials and situations speak for themselves, so to speak, about watching, observing, being, almost in a Zen-like way, you could say. A key figure in all of this was, of course, John Cage, also a composer, like Morton Feldman. John Cage was really not the type to form a group or start a movement, even less a revolution. No, in his own subtle way, John Cage was just doing his work and talking about his ideas of chance operations and indeterminacy and other strategies. And then, also in the 50s, he seemed to have an ability to be present at more or less all important events related to the development of a new understanding of what art and music could be. So, to make a long story short, John Cage was simply immensely important. For example, in 1952, he was part of what is considered to be the first multimedia artwork, the first happening, you could say, which took place at the Progressive Art School, Black Mountain College in North Carolina, and also included the participation of the artist Robert Rauschenberg and the dancer and choreographer Merce Cunningham and others. And also in 1952, Cage premiered what was possibly his most famous composition, entitled 433, a piece that consisted of a musician sitting in front of a piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds without touching it. while the audience was listening to the sounds in the room or to their own inner rumblings or whatever they were listening to. Later in the 50s, Cage was giving classes in musical composition at the New School for Social Research, which was for many decades a tremendously important institution in New York for the teaching of art and for the exchanging of new ideas about art. And since today's subject is Fluxus, we might as well jump ahead and mention that a number of the key members of the Fluxus group that came together in the early 60s first met at Cage's class at the New School in the late 50s. One of them was Dick Higgins, who coined the term intermedia, the idea of crossing over from one art form, from one media into another, a very important concept in Fluxus, and who also later founded one of the most important small press publishing houses of the time called Something Else Press. Another artist present was Alan Cabrow, who is considered to be one of the inventors of the happening as an art form, famously presented at an event entitled 18 Happenings in 6 parts, which took place at the Rubin Gallery in New York in October 1959. And a third of the later Fluxus artists who could be mentioned in this context was George Brecht, who also in the late 50s developed the idea of the event score, or the instruction piece, that was another term for it, a totally new way of thinking about art. Instead of making paintings or composing music in a conventional way, George Brecht wrote short texts which could serve as instructions for other artists, or for anyone for that matter, and that was the point, to perform certain actions with the aim of creating an effect, like the piece Drip Music from 1951, in which part of the score read, "A source of dripping water and an empty vessel are arranged so that the water falls into the vessel." So, drip, 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 that was the piece. As I said, anyone could perform drip music, either by actually carrying out the instructions of the score or by simply imagining it in their minds. In either way, there was a good chance that having performed or experienced the work, drip music, people would afterwards pay attention to the dripping sound of water in their own kitchen sink in a completely different way, with a heightened sense of awareness, or maybe even as a piece of music, or simply as an artwork by George Brecht. A complete breakdown of the usual boundaries between art and life, which was precisely the point. Now enter George Maciunas, a Lithuanian-born immigrant, as you all know, with a fragile health and an insatiable appetite for avant-garde art and everything else new that he was experiencing in his adopted home, New York City. George Maciunas and his family had arrived to the United States in 1948, escaping the turmoil of the Second World War and everything else that followed. And shortly after, still being a teenager, George was born in 1931, he enlisted at the Cooper Union School of Art in East Village in New York, beginning his education as a graphic designer, and thus learning the skills that would later come to good use when he took it upon himself to design all the publications related to Fluxus. In the early 50s, Maciunas relocated to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to study architecture at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, and this was where he was first introduced to the work of John Cage and other avant-garde artists of the time. At this point, his dream was to become either an architect or an art historian. Then fast forward to 1960, where Maciunas was back in New York City and was enrolled at the New School for Social Research, where he followed a class about electronic music by the composer Richard Maxfield, also a student of John Cage. At this point, Maciunas had begun to develop a highly personal and, I guess you could say, somewhat eccentric set of ideas about avant-garde art and politics. Altogether, a vision of a new society or even a new world order that could be brought about by revolutionizing our concept of art and then somehow apply this whole new way of thinking into various social and political contexts. Then enter Yoko Ono, another important character in this narrative, who might as well serve as an example of some of the approaches which were characteristic to Fluxus. Born and raised in Japan, Yoko Ono, like George Maciunas, came to the United States in her teens and embarked upon an artistic journey which, inspired by John Cage and others, took her from a more classical perception of music and art that she was brought up with to a new position which in many ways preceded the formats and strategies of Fluxus. First of all, Yoko Ono, from a very early stage, I think even from about 1953 or thereabouts, began to develop the idea of instruction pieces, quite similar to those of George Brecht that I talked about before. That is, she wrote short texts, like Brecht, almost like poems, but not quite, that could be considered to be scores for various kinds of actions. And typical of the transdisciplinary thinking of many of the artists connected with Fluxus, these texts could be applied to various media or materials, music, performance, film, etc. And if we look at Yoko Ono's film work as an example, we will see that even a quite long and almost documentary-like work, like the film entitled Rape from 1969, it is actually a realization of a score. Meaning, the original form of the work is the text, the concept, which anyone in theory could choose to realize or just perform in the mind. But it could also happen that Yoko Ono, in some cases, would choose to realize the idea of the text as an actual physical artwork, in this case, a film. However, to give you an idea of the variety of Fluxus works, I would like to mention that not all instruction pieces will necessarily lend themselves to the production of a physical work. If we take a Yoko Ono piece like Film Script 5, we will see that it consists of 3 different challenges to the reader. All of them tasks that could be carried out in connection with any existing film, also by other directors, mainstream or other. If it was, say, a film with Rock Hudson and Doris Day, the instruction was to ignore Hudson and only look at Doris Day. And if it was a color film, the instruction was not to look at the color blue, but only red. If blue comes out on the screen, close your eyes or do something so you do not see it. And if you saw it, then make believe that you have not seen it, or punish yourself. Another piece by Yoko Ono, Film Script 4, consists of an even more simple instruction. Ask audience to stare at the screen until it becomes black. You can imagine it could be quite a long work. In both examples, it was conceptual works that operated with the idea that no matter which film it was, it would, by way of the instructions, become a new work, a work by Yoko Ono. And at the same time, it was artworks that had a full validity, no matter if they were actually carried out or just read as a kind of mind games. In late 1960 and early 61, Yoko Ono hosted a series of events, art events in her loft in Chambers Street on the southern tip of Manhattan, usually referred to as the Chambers Street series. As a co-curator, she had involved yet another person in this story, the minimal composer Lamont Young, an artist that was typical of the whole scene that we are trying to sort of paint a picture of here, in the sense that he was included into Fluxus by George Maciunas, but always himself denied to be part of Fluxus. More about that later. But why did Yoko Ono choose Lamont Young as her ally for this series? That is quite easy to understand if we look at his approach to composing music. Because rather than using conventional notation systems, Lamont Young created his minimal compositions by writing texts that in their concepts were quite similar to the instruction pieces of George Brecht and Yoko Ono. One example could be a poem for chairs, benches, tables, etc., a piece written in January 1960, and consisting of a text that is instructing the performer to drag chairs, benches, tables, and all other objects across the floor with the intention of creating an interesting sound. Another one could be Composition 1960 number 3, which could almost be said to be an extension of John Cage's 433 that I mentioned before, but is suggesting an even more open situation. The score of this piece reads, "Announce to the audience when the piece will begin and end, if there is a limit on the duration. It may be of any duration. Then announce that everyone may do whatever he wishes for the duration of the composition." Can hardly be more open than that. Anyway, what Yoko Ono and Lamont Young presented over a number of weeks in the winter of 1960-61 was a broad selection of cutting-edge, avant-garde art, experimental art, sort of installation work, performances, even though the term performance art had not yet been coined at that time, but anyway, electronic music and other kinds of avant-garde compositions, etc. And of course, everyone with an interest in art and music in New York at that time showed up for these events, from Marcel Duchamp to John Cage. They all came. And most importantly in this context, also George Maciunas showed up and found that the kind of approach to art that he had been looking for as a vehicle for his visions of a cultural revolution was precisely what was being presented at the Chambers Street series. So, again, to make a long story a little shorter, what Maciunas did next was to decide to take the avant-garde uptown, so to speak. So to move the ideas that formed the so-called downtown scene of New York to the wealthier and, in a social and political sense, more influential environments of Madison Avenue. So in 1961, George Maciunas and another Lithuanian friend opened a gallery, the AG Gallery on Madison Avenue, and tried to more or less repeat what Yoko Ono and Lamont Young had done downtown, which turned out to be maybe a little more difficult than he had expected. So to get things going, he decided that instead of sort of trying to compete with the downtown artists, he would sort of make them his allies. And one of the artists that he invited to exhibit at the AG Gallery was Yoko Ono, who showed a selection of her more object-oriented artworks, like her painting to be stepped on, a piece of canvas lying on the ground so you could step on it. And here I would like to deviate a little bit from my manuscript because during these wonderful days I've had here in Lithuania, I had a chance to go to Kaunas, and as you probably know, in Kaunas you will find the childhood home of George Maciunas, and in front of the house is a sort of a square that has now been renamed to the George Maciunas Square. And on the building on the opposite side of the square, there was a big poster, and on that poster was the face of Yoko Ono. So, you know, some people, first of all, George Maciunas was the first to recognize Yoko Ono as an artist in her own right in the early 60s, so she was very grateful to him for that. And some people say that she was even in love with him. So I found it very beautiful to see that now Yoko Ono is hanging on the wall on the opposite side of the street looking at George Maciunas' childhood home. That's poetry, real life poetry. Anyway, the Yoko Ono show sold absolutely nothing, the show at the AG Gallery. And it actually caused George Maciunas to shut down the gallery, but that didn't hold him back because a seed had now been planted. And from this point on, he began to orchestrate that whole series of events and initiatives that eventually became Fluxus. To put it as simple as possible, and actually using Yoko Ono's words, Fluxus was George Maciunas, and George Maciunas was Fluxus. As simple as that. Nobody wanted to give a name to all the different things that went on in the avant-garde art in New York at the time. George Maciunas decided to call it Fluxus. Nobody wanted to consider it to be a new movement in art. George Maciunas made it into a movement. Nobody wanted to commit themselves to Maciunas' activities as members of a club or a group or something like that. Maciunas created lists of members on a regular basis, and on a regular basis kicked some artists out and included others, often without their consent or even their knowledge. And nobody wanted to sign a manifesto, which, of course, you may have guessed it already, didn't keep Maciunas from writing one manifesto after the other and claim about each and every one of them that they were expressing the common aims of the artists appearing under the Fluxus banner. In his first Fluxus Manifesto, written in February 1963, and if you go to the picture gallery in Kaunas, you can see this manifesto on the wall, Maciunas set the following goal to, and I quote, purge the world of bourgeois sickness, intellectual, professional, and commercialized culture, purge the world of dead art, imitation, artificial art, abstract art, illusionistic art, mathematical art, purge the world of Europeanism. Promote a revolutionary flood and tide in art, promote living art, anti-art, promote non-art reality to be grasped by all peoples, not only critics, dilettantes, and professionals. That's part of the first one. 2 years later, in 1965, in another manifesto, and there were some in between, Maciunas was encouraging his artists to demonstrate that anything can be art and anyone can do it. He was now deep into an anti-art way of thinking that caused many observers and also even some of the artists involved to label Fluxus as neo-Dadaism or just neo-Dada. And Maciunas stated that the activities that he now termed art amusement should be simple, amusing, unpretentious, concerned with insignificances, require no skill or countless rehearsals, have no commodity or institutional value. And finally, he summed up the essence of Fluxus as the fusion of Spike Jones, vaudeville, gag, children's games, and Duchamp. Quite a mix. So, Fluxus, in the mind of George Maciunas, was, in a sense, anti-art, a complete rebellion against anything bourgeois and against all conventional concepts of art by simply disregarding the rules and conventions which had up till that point been developed and accepted by art history. And the most simple and beautiful formulation of that I have ever heard came from the Korean-born artist Namjoon Paik, whom I interviewed for my documentary, which you will see in a minute, The Misfits, 30 Years of Fluxus. Most of the interviews in that film were done in connection with the Biennale, which might already have been mentioned, I'm not sure, in Venice in 1990, where many of the original Fluxus artists were gathered to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the first events in New York that led into the creation of artists. And then I did some additional interviews in the following years, 91, 92, one of them with Namjoon Paik in New York in 1992. In that interview, Paik said, "I don't think in art games you can win the game, but you can win the game by changing the rules of the game." Very simple put. And that was exactly what George Maciunas was doing by making Fluxus into an anti-art endeavor. But Fluxus was not only anti-art, it was also anti-institutional, in the way that it was a rebellion against authorities and institutions in every sense of the word, against institutionalized ways of thinking about art, but also against art institutions as power structures. And it was anti-commercial, in the way that it was an attempt to break away from the idea of art as an object, art as a commodity that can be bought and sold. So Maciunas wanted to do away with the whole commercial gallery system. And to achieve all of the above, the most important contribution by George Maciunas to the Fluxus history was, in my opinion at least, the concept of the Fluxus concert, an art presentation as a kind of concert or theater or vaudeville or cabaret that consisted of a program of short events or performance pieces by various Fluxus artists. And it was important for Maciunas that they were short, should be entertaining. That was Fluxus in its purest form. But in fact, Fluxus in that form only existed for a relatively short period of time. In 1962, George Maciunas got a job in Wiesbaden and relocated to Germany. And this, of course, caused an interruption in the many Fluxus plans that he had begun to develop at that point in New York. But on the other hand, it provided an opportunity to take the show on the road, so to speak. So in 1962 and 63, Maciunas organized a series of Fluxus concerts, beginning in Wiesbaden in Germany in September 1962, and soon after continuing to Copenhagen in Denmark in November. In Denmark, the Fluxus event, I know that from reading the reviews of that time, caused a great deal of wonderment, at least, and confusion among the local audiences and art critics, partly because not very many at that time were ready to regard the making of an enormous salad to be a work of art. The salad piece, which will be talked about in the film in a minute, was a work by the Fluxus artist Alison Knowles. And it was also an event that led to the inclusion into the Fluxus group of two very important Danish artists, Erik Andersen and Henning Christiansen, both composers, but neither of them writing music in a traditional sense and therefore being perfect for the Fluxus concept. And around the same time there were events in Paris and London and various other cities throughout Europe, all of which made it possible for Maciunas to further expand his Fluxus, flock you could say, and create an international network of like-minded allies. Again, often without their consent or knowledge. For instance, the Danish painter Per Kirkeby, whom I knew quite well, has told a story about how he, simply by visiting George Maciunas in New York in 1966 and asking about his activities, was immediately included into Fluxus. And even, he was a painter in a more traditional sense, but George Maciunas just included him right away and also appointed him to be a leader of a branch that Maciunas called Fluxus North. Well, Denmark is north, so you can be the leader of that. And subsequently, this Per Kirkeby appeared in various lists of Fluxus artists without ever appearing in a Fluxus context. And so it went. But as time is flying and I should end soon, I will just conclude this talk with having a brief look at what happened after this intense period in the first half of the 60s, which by many Fluxus historians is considered to be sort of the essential Fluxus years. After having moved back to New York in the mid-60s, the international nature of the Fluxus network made it more difficult for George Maciunas to continue with the concert format, where all the artists had to be present at the same time. So instead he moved on to explore other options. And from that point on, Fluxus became mainly sort of an umbrella term for a number of different newsletters and other kinds of publications. Most remarkable, the so-called Flux boxes. In 1961, in the very beginning, when Maciunas came up with the Fluxus moniker, it was actually thought of as the name of a projected magazine, which was never realized. So Fluxus should really have been the name of a magazine. And some of the material that was gathered for that purpose were later sort of channeled into one of the most important Fluxus anthologies, an anthology of scores and artworks and essays and other things, simply called an anthology. That's the title. It was edited by Lamont Young and Jackson McLough and published in 1963. But now, a few years later, in the mid-60s, Maciunas, who was trained as a graphic designer, as I said, launched the idea of flux boxes as a kind of magazines, but in reality more like multiples or artist books or whatever. Sort of limited editions of actual wooden or cardboard boxes sometimes, filled with event scores or other types of material created by Fluxus artists, and in some cases also by Maciunas himself. So they were the sort of normal flux boxes, and there were something called Fluxus year boxes, which came out once a year, and there were other types, also something called Flux kits that were more like a kind of suitcase filled again with Fluxus objects. And from that point out on, it really sort of spread out, and Maciunas moved on to incorporate a lot of other sorts of activities into his sort of Fluxus empire. There was Fluxus food, Fluxus furniture, Fluxus sports, Fluxus weddings. And even when George Maciunas himself was diagnosed with cancer in the late 70s, he planned his own funeral as a Fluxus event. It may all sound silly or maybe a bit far-fetched, but not only did Fluxus enter into our language and become a category in art history, it also made a real impact on the social and economical history of New York in the way that it was actually George Maciunas who founded the district of Soho as an art community by beginning to take over empty buildings in that area with the intention of establishing so-called Fluxus cooperatives. That was really what the start of what was known later as artist lofts in Soho. And it was not only, from his point of view, with the purpose of providing cheap housing and working spaces for artists, it also had a broader vision of creating the foundation for a new and more humane society. But there's more. In the very last minutes of my Fluxus film, which I promise you will see very soon, Nam June Paik, whom I mentioned before, the Korean-born artist, is telling an anecdote about how Fluxus, in a sense, contributed to nothing less than the liberation of Lithuania. The anecdote might be told with tongue-in-cheek, but I'm quite sure that Paik also meant it seriously, on a certain level at least. And since, unfortunately, it is a little difficult to understand Paik's English in the film, I will end this talk by giving you a brief summary of his statement. What Paik is saying is, in short, that the Fluxus group was very proud to be associated with an artist by the name of Landsbergis, who will need no introduction in this room, and who in the late 80s, as you all know, was the leader of this political movement called Sąjūdis, which, according to Paik, and I've heard that this is actually almost correct, means something similar to Fluxus, like being in motion, moving, not fixed. So, Paik is saying Landsbergis was the leader of this quote-unquote Fluxus party, Sąjūdis, which fought for the independence of Lithuania from the Soviet Union, and after the independence declaration was made in March 1990, he became the first head of parliament of a free Lithuania, in effect, the first president. I don't think that was the term, but anyway. So the point Paik is making is that Landsbergis was the leader of what Paik considered to be a Fluxus party, which changed the history of Lithuania and thus changed the world. That is quite something. Of course, I have to say that personally, I'm not sure if this story is actually meant to be sort of a Fluxus work in itself by Nam June Paik, or if there's any truth to it. Perhaps you can tell me, maybe you can educate me after the film. In any case, it is my firm belief that Fluxus made quite a mark on the world. And all of this simply because, for some reason, a rift appeared in our understanding of art for some short period of time in the 50s, as Morton Feldman stated in the quote in the beginning of this talk, this brief moment of maybe 6 weeks where nobody understood art. That's why it all happened. Thank you so much for listening. I will stick around. I'm not sure if there's time for any Q&A, but I will be here and we can talk if you wish, and until we are all thrown out of the museum. Please enjoy the film.